Hello, man, mer, and fellows all, to the first episode from me in a long time. Um, this episode will focus on the Elder Scrolls universe this time around. Something I'm hoping to turn into an actual series of videos, by the way. Uh, yeah, following a lengthy detour into the void, I'm returning with the first and what I hope will be many more episodes on the subject. Today focusing on the Summerset chapter releasing an ESO in a couple weeks' time, or actually less than that. So in the beginning, or rather somewhere near it, there were the Aldmer. Having arrived from Aldmeris, or Old Elnofe, they settled in the Summerset Isles and established the cradle of Aldmeri civilization in the region. The isles themselves consisted of 3 islands. Specifically, these were the Summerset, Artaeum, and Oridon Islands. Now, we've seen a bit of Oridon, actually, those of us who have played through ESO's story and those of us fond of that particular area in the world. It's such a unique and vibrant and colourful space, so I'm actually really excited to see the rest of it. So anyway, in a time when Tamriel itself was only beginning to experience the first of what will come to be the many races and varied races to call the supercontinent home, the Aldmeri settlers established Eleanor, the capital of Summerset. As their civilization advanced through the ages, new ideas gave way to new ideologies, and so the Aldmeri people came to worship the likes of Auriel, Finaster, and Cerebane, to name a few. This divergence in faith from previous ancestor worship led to the creation of the Psijic Order, a sect of mystics dedicated to the worship of their ancestors, basically. Frustrated at this divergence, the Psijics left and settled on Artaeum, where they would henceforth serve solely as advisors and keepers of the old way. As they continued to grow, this fledgling civilization, expeditions to the mainland revealed ample opportunity for the adventurous to carve out their own path in relatively untouched lands, where even the lowest in Aldmeri society could grow and thrive in nobility. This exodus is generally considered to have led to the birth of the various elven races of Tamriel, although I'm a bit skeptical. I mean, either I'm confused or there's some conflicting information there. But, yeah, another time. The Aldmeri, for much of the First and Second Era, were very isolationist. They viewed their race as being above those of the other 8 races. Having been descended from divinity, the High Elves were a naturally superior breed, or so they thought, both intellectually and physically, which really is how they justified enslaving goblins to do menial work they themselves thought was beneath them. Poor goblins. Although, to be fair, it probably also didn't help that the Slowden Morma from the neighbouring Thras and Pyandanea kept invading them. It is believed that the Slode once held Summerset as a territory and likely weren't too happy about these uppity elves showing up and claiming it as theirs. As for the Morma, well, they were probably just dicks. In any case, Summerset's timeline throughout the First and Second Era is rife with accounts of attacks from both factions. Luckily, the High Elves, masters of naval warfare, were able to best their unyielding attackers each and every time with such skill that they almost never made landfall. Indeed, there are areas in Summerset that have never known conflict, despite the numerous and repeated efforts of the Slode and Morma. Can any other civilization in all of Tamriel make such a claim? Of course they can, but this is undoubtedly an achievement worthy of note anyway. As such, it is easy to see how they might have wanted to keep their borders closed, not merely because of their pronounced xenophobic attitude, but also because they are a repeatedly besieged civilization. Does that sound apologist? Yeah, I can't really start with a, yeah, they're racist, but they get attacked too, so meh. Anyway, so where to from here? Well, I suppose I'll just jump to the Third and Fourth Era quickly because I want to take my time with the Second Era, in particular the gaping canonic void that is the early middle second in which the events of ESO take place. As this is the episode leading up to the release of the Summerset chapter, that's not something I want to gloss over. No, so the Third Era kicked off when Tiber Septim arrived in Summerset, concluding his tour of Tamriel and the Tiber Wars with the last of the territories to be conquered and brought into his new empire. He arrived with a sweet new toy given to him by a grateful and powerful tribunal in the form of a large brass god known as the Numidium. Built by a Dwemer known as Kagrenak, this monstrous weapon was able to conquer Eleanor in an hour, thus sealing the fate of the rest of the Isles. Tiber Septim, aided by this fancy new toy in the year 896 of the Second Era, was able to fold Summerset into the Empire and conclude the Tiber Wars and proclaim the beginning of a new era, the Third Era. Despite the appearances of a relatively unified civilization, the Ultima of the Summerset Isles are in fact quite fractured, as the early Ultima of Summerset had diverted away from the worship of their ancestors in favour of other deities. Newer generations of Ultima were beginning to revert back to ancestor worship more in line with the ideals of the Psijic Order. As such, they themselves eventually saw a surge in membership. Normally, such dissent would be met with exile, the get the F out, you filthy heretic. This became less and less viable the closer malcontent encroached on Ultima society. It was much easier to throw disagreeable people out of your society when they are on the fringes, but not so much when they are more prominent. With the youth of Summerset seeking change, holding an increasingly critical view of the time-tested tradition of xenophobia and the rigid hierarchical society of the time, a cultural shift began to take place. Unprecedented and entirely significant was the acceptance of other cultures and peoples within High Elf society, as their youth began to attempt to redefine what it meant to be a High Elf. One known example of this is the appointment of a Dunmer as Queen of First Hold in Oregon. Recognizing that, for the entirety of their existence, in wider Tamriel, the High Elves believed themselves entirely superior to everyone else, would have never entrusted rule over any other High Elf territory to anyone other than a High Elf. This is actually a big deal. However, not all was, shall we say, attractive, alluring, pleasing to the eye, handsome, even. No? Well, anyway, a faction known as the Beautiful emerged, originally as a reasoned group of artists who believed that if Summerset was to move forward, it had to be able to let go of its past. Somehow, this group became decidedly more forceful, violent, in their efforts as they developed into a revolutionary gang that attempted to realize its philosophical beginnings with the destruction of monuments to Aldmeri civilization. So basically, they turned from being a group of artists who felt a certain way about Summerset's future to being all about kicking down every last temple, tower, or relic that meant anything to Ultima history or culture. Which is a bloody shame! Anyway, after a failed attempt to destroy the iconic Crystal Tower, haha to them, they ended up vandalizing other icons of Summerset's past and even elevated their attacks to the full-blown murder of monarchs, specifically the murder of the daughter of the King of Shimmerine, is one that, at the very least, has succeeded in drawing attention to their cause through horror and disgust. It's worth noting, before I begin talking about the events of the Second Era, specifically just anything of relevance to Summerset during the time of ESO's story in the region, the Aldmeri Dominion, 3 iterations of which exist in Elder Scrolls lore. I'll start with the third and jump back to the first. So simply referred to as the Aldmeri Dominion, despite being the 3rd iteration, were composed of a faction known as the Thalmor in the 4th era, which are a group of elf supremacists who reckon they want to undo all the social progress undertaken by other Ultima, and just go back to being the elves on top. I just wanted to point out that, because it's a funny little parallel to other things in the real world today. Ha ha ha, topical. Anyway, I digress. The first iteration of the Dominion began in response to the invasion of the Imperial City by forces representing the interests of Molag Bal, established when Queen Irana Aldmeri of the High Elves reached out to the Bosma of Valenwood and the Khajiit of elsewhere, fearing the young and short-lived existence of man was insufficient to rule Tamriel. Queen Irene felt that the Bosma and Khajiit were, like themselves, much more reasonable and much more sophisticated. They feared that the younger, less sophisticated races of Tamriel would do more harm than good if allowed to wrest control from Molag Bal and, well, seize it for themselves. And so that's where the cinematic trailers from ESO's beginning comes in. But seriously, if the 3rd iteration of the Aldmeri Dominion is one end of the High Elf spectrum, then this is undoubtedly the other. Although, interestingly, Queen Irene often comes across as being quite progressive in her interactions with the player character and various others. She often questions her actions and always seeks counsel of those around her, despite repeated betrayals from within her inner circle in Oregon and throughout the Dominion. This, for me, almost contrasts what we know of the Dominion in her actions alone. A second iteration of the Dominion emerges in the later period of the Second Era, long after the Three Banners War. Interestingly again, this second iteration was made up of the same races as before, but with the addition of the Morma this time, an old enemy of the High Elves. It began in response to a fight over the Cameron throne, I believe, and ended when Tiber Septim showed up in Eleanor. Remember that? Well, anyway, in terms of the story, around the time of ESO's main story, this obviously follows on from the Five Companions that concluded when we, with the help of Meridia, gave Molag Bal the cosmic backhand and closed his little random anchor generator in Cold Harbor. God, I'm Mysterian. No. The story in Summerset is almost certainly the next step in the Daedric War story. Now, this has been known for quite some time, and it involves a plot between three Daedric princes to seek power over the others. Specifically, these princes are Clavicus Vile, Mephala, and Nocturnal. We battled Clavicus Vile and his hound Barbas when they tried to siphon power from Vivek, and we fought Nocturnal's forces when she attempted to take power from Sotha Sil in his Clockwork City. And finally, Mephala, who has her sights set on Summerset, is gearing to unleash her spindly-legged brand of pure hellborn madness on the home of the High Elves. Why is this a thing, you ask? Well, I'll tell you. It would appear that each of the three princes, again as I mentioned, is seeking to gain power advantage over the others, and Vivek and the people of Summerset are just the pawns they seek to use to achieve their nefarious goals. Now, the cinematic trailer for Summerset has been circulating the internet for a short time now, and right away in viewing it, we know that the contents of the story will involve the next stage in this overarching story. Early on in the trailer, we see a silhouette of Clavicus Vile, identifiable by his mask, and Barbas by his side. Further in, as a high elf is slaughtered at the end of a blade held by a masked figure saying, "For purity." In the distance, we see a figure with spider-like legs emerging from the back, this visage commonly associated with Mephala. And finally, towards the end, right before the griffin knocked the Dominion champion off the side of the cliff, we see a visage of a cloaked person with two crows sitting on either shoulder. This person commonly associated with Nocturnal. This is just exciting. So if you'll indulge me, I have a theory, because I think this will be the conclusion to the Daedric War, if not a major turning point in the story. Why? Well, though we've had a trailer for Morrowind, we haven't really had the presence of this conflict represented here until now. Obviously, this simply means that we're late in the game and there's no point in being coy. ZeniMax is choosing not to pretend like its player base doesn't know what's going on. But I also feel that because it is so overtly present in the trailer in a way that we haven't seen before, it suggests that we are approaching a turning point in the story. The final stretch where the stakes are higher and the goblins don't matter. Sorry, little high elf humor. But let's say for the sake of argument that we are rapidly approaching the climax of this story. What should we expect? I think, to be fair, in all likelihood we should expect the content in size and depth to be equal to that of a standard PvE zone, because if you look at Summerset, it looks like it would have a fair few cities with about the same number of delves, world bosses, and dungeons that any normal zone would have. Which is perfectly fine. In fact, it's actually a pretty sweet deal. I mean, Morrowind was no letdown. It had a lot in it. But in terms of story, should we expect something massive? In terms of the story that plays out, will the story that plays out in Summerset actually include all three Daedra actively vying for power, or will it just be Mephala? It's hard to say, because if we accept that the story is in its third and final act, then we have to accept that the story will be aiming for a resolution, which means the climax we're looking at is going to be quite swift. Now, based on the trailer, I want to believe the story may well include all three Daedra, but because we've already seen Clavicus Vile and Nocturnal, Mephala may play a greater role. In fact, she almost certainly will. And the reason I think it's likely that all three Daedra would be present is that I think them being shown in the trailer is meant to convey more than a reference to the Daedric War itself. I think we have seen them almost as though they're closing in, and I think there is a real reason for that. But also the fact that, again, accepting this as the final act, we might expect all three to be putting everything on the line here. I mean, Clavicus Vile and Nocturnal have already failed, and may be desperate, and may well want to prevent Mephala from achieving her goal. Mephala has yet to be tested, as well. I mean, we've got some experience here in thwarting the world-ending efforts of the Daedric princes. Lastly, a faction that up until this point in the video I've only made somewhat casual mentions to, but which I feel will play an important role in the events of Summerset, is of course the Psijic Order. Now, we will have access to an entirely new Psijic Order skill line, opening us up to the school of magic known as mysticism, or perhaps more accurately, the Psijic Order brand of mysticism. Now, the Psijic Order for much of Tamriel's history have been reclusive and highly selective advisors to various kings, and in terms of what we might expect of the Order in relation to ESO's story is a little hard to say. Interestingly, the Order and the entire island of Artaeum vanished at the beginning of the Second Era, and only returned about 500 years later, which would have coincided with the Plane Meld and the Three Banners War. Now, that feels like a thing to me. The reason for their disappearance and eventual return is unknown, but I do wonder if both were deliberate action on their part, and that their return was in response to the events we are now faced with, but more than likely to aid in the thwarting of the Daedric assaults on Nirn by Clavicus, Vile, Nocturnal, and Mephala. And I feel I can say this because it is known that some in the Order are able to glean glimpses of the future, and likely foresaw, as we did through the Aldmeri Champion in the trailer, the true threat Summerset now faces. I believe they will act in accordance with their historic role as advisors and help the hero in their effort to protect Summerset and Nirn from the Ognathyr, or Bad Change, in the form of the Daedric threat. And really, this is exciting, as even though there is a fair amount of information out there concerning the Order, I don't think we've really ever been this close to them. The closest arguably being their intervention at the College of Winterhold in the Fourth Era when they collected the Eye of Magnus, and assisted the lone hero in thwarting the Thalmor agenda. Finally, it is also worth noting that the Order keeps the entrance to a portal to Oblivion, through which it is believed that Sotha Sil once communed with the Daedric princes. I do wonder if that will be a point of interest in the story. The Dreaming Cave, as it is known, is a portal to Oblivion, but can it be used both ways? To be honest, I have no idea. But one way or another, I am certain we may well find out. Anyway, I think that pretty much concludes this video. I'd like to thank anyone who stuck it out and found this piece informative. If there's anything important you feel I haven't covered, please feel free to engage me, as I am always open to reasoned discussions on Elder Scrolls lore, recognizing that I am far from the only student on the subject out there. But anyway, please do, if you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe, and share generously if you are so inclined. Regardless, I hope to engage in more Elder Scrolls related ramblings in the time to come, and may it branch out further, as TES and Destiny are not the only relevant franchises of which I would love to talk about at nauseating length. With all that said, be well, take care, and hail Sithis. I'll see you all next time.